Today I'll discuss how a constraint-led approach grounded in ecological dynamics may help develop a more adaptable roundhouse kick. Traditionally, in martial arts and combat sports, it is often coached through repetitive technical rehearsal. However, combat is chaotic, unstable, and constantly changing. As Davids and colleagues suggest, movement emerges through interaction between the athlete, the task, and the environment. So the question is, how do we develop a kick that remains functional under pressure rather than simply looking technically correct? I'm not interested in creating a kick that only survives perfect training conditions. I'm genuinely interested in developing a movement solution that survives chaos. The traditional style of coaching often relies on the coach imposing a single ideal movement template. Ecological Dynamics provides the theoretical foundation for the constraint-led approach by viewing the athlete as a self-organizing system. This links directly to Newell's constraints model, the organism, meaning the athlete, the task, and the environment. Movement behavior emerges through the interaction of those constraints. So it's not like either coach installs movement patterns into the athlete's brain, like uploading software onto a computer program as if they are a robot. Instead, the coach becomes an environment designer to preferably simulate real sporting conditions, sort of like an architect, for example. So it's the constraints that guide the movement to allow adaptable coordination to begin and emerge through interaction. Yearby and colleagues apply this directly to combat through representative and alive training. So the constraint-led approach does not chase one perfect movement solution. It develops movement solutions that can reorganize under changing conditions. Bernstein introduced the concept of repetition without repetition. And in simple coaching language, my interpretation and logic that links to this terminology would be no roundhouse kick is the same. And this directly reflects Bernstein's point. Skilled movement is not identical repetition. The athlete is repeatedly solving the same movement problem through slightly different coordinative solutions. The blue pathway represents the global movement solution, balance, sequencing, and force transfer. And on the other hand, the purple pathways represent local adaptations, hip position, timing, foot placement, and force direction. Research from Estevan, Valco, and Wazik supports this because target distance, target conditions, and environmental information can alter kick coordination. Bernstein also discussed freezing and freeing degrees of freedom. Early learners often freeze variability to simplify control, which is why movement can appear stiff and robotic during early skill acquisition. And skilled performers progressively free and exploit variability functionally, which is why movement appears smoother and more adaptable in comparison to what we observe between the more advanced performers and the early learners. This brings us to dexterity, which is far more than movement precision in stable environments. Dexterity is maintaining functional movement solutions under changing constraints and pressure. We are trying to permanently stain adaptability into the movement system. No matter how many washes that athletes go through, meaning them being exposed to fabricated, realistic, simulated conditions under stress, fatigue, chaos, etc., nevertheless, the stain should still remain. A common misunderstanding of the constraint-led approach is that athletes should immediately be thrown into chaos, and that is not my argument in this presentation. First, athletes need stability and to build foundational stable attractor patterns. Then variability and perturbation can be gradually introduced through exposure into increasingly challenging environmental demands. So the coach's role is calibrating a ratio of finely balanced training sessions to aid attunement, meaning that the task must be challenging enough to stimulate adaptation, but not so chaotic that movement organization collapses, which then defeats the purpose of my method in this presentation. Something I'd say in my own coaching language is, you can't learn to swim if you aren't prepared to get wet. So developing adaptable combat skill in highly controlled environments is like practicing swimming on dry land. At this stage, George represents the constrained coordination stage, where physical constraints are deliberately manipulated to shape behaviour. This is where my coaching rationale begins with the 3 Cs: constrain the space, couple the perception, and calibrate the feedback. Gibson's key idea is affordances, which are invitations for action. Affordances emerge relative to the athlete's positioning, the timing, capability, perception, and environmental information. So in combat, athletes are constantly perceiving and acting on changing affordance landscapes. Pinder and colleagues linked this to representative learning design, where practice should preserve key information from performance. And Yearby and colleagues then apply this logic to a live combat training. So the roundhouse kick becomes less about reproducing one perfect shape and more about adapting to opportunities in real time. This is where Gibson becomes really important. Movement cannot be separated from the information guiding it, and perception and action work like yin and yang as 2 continuous processes that must align to create an effective movement solution. With Dimitri, the athlete perceives information and adapts movement in response. Different targets create different affordances. As you can see here in the video, the slam ball target invites force and recoil, and the suspended ball target invites greater precision, timing, and postural control demands. Wazik and colleagues showed that changing target conditions can alter kick kinematics and movement organisation. So the athlete must recalibrate timing, spatial awareness, force application, and coordination. This is where dexterity becomes visible, not just movement execution, but movement adaptability under variability and pressure. And finally, with Blake, applying the Dowell method at this stage bridges stable practice and chaotic performance through representative perturbation. And this allows exposure to live perturbations and informational constraints to now enter the system more aggressively. The athlete is no longer just rehearsing movement patterns. They are simultaneously solving movement problems under changing environmental conditions. Pinder's representative learning design supports this because practice must preserve key information from performance, and Yearby's work supports this through a live interaction in combat environments. I want to stress that this is just not random chaos. It is a progressively calibrated bridge towards representative adaptability. Again, how can you learn to swim if you are not prepared to get wet? So if we were to move beyond this presentation, the next step would be testing whether George, Dimitri and Blake can retain these adaptive qualities outside of this training structure. With this next stage, practice becomes more representative of actual combat. This includes freestyle pad work, small combat games and Shark Tank environments. Combat skill is not isolated technique. Combat skill is perception, timing, adaptation, decision making and action occurring together. Algi and colleagues show how small combat games manipulate opponent and space constraints to develop technical tactical adaptability. Renshaw and colleagues also emphasise that coaches design representative environments that preserve the informational demands of competition. So the athlete is no longer simply practicing a roundhouse kick. They are learning to perceive opportunities for action under live pressure. Again, we are aiming to both permanently retain and develop the skill concurrently over a periodization of given time. This skill needs to appear like a permanent stain on a shirt, no matter how many washes it goes through. In the same way, a permanent skill shows adaptability into the system and not create a movement that only survives highly controlled environments. So now we are at the stage of where feedback connects back to the whole progression. George's environment is high constraint and more guidance. Dimitri's environment begins with recognizing errors through target adaptation, and Blake's environment has less cueing via myself under live perturbation. So if the environment drives learning, does the coach become redundant? Absolutely not. Either coach still remain essential. However, the difference is that feedback becomes more selective, targeted, and supportive of long-term self-regulation. Wolf and Chivialski support this through attentional focus and self-controlled feedback. Janyario and Cavazana are important here because they relate knowledge of results and knowledge of performance to martial arts skill learning. Rather than overcorrecting every movement immediately, the athlete self-evaluates first. Then the coach adds knowledge of results and knowledge of performance after reflection to guide correction without creating dependency. When the athlete can identify their own error in real time, I can assume as a coach they're confidently moving from dependency to genuinely learning. This slide critically evaluates the progression itself, what it achieved, and where it becomes challenging. Across George, Dimitri, and Blake, the progression appeared to reduce dependency on explicit instruction, encourage adaptable coordination under changing constraints, and improve perception-action coupling as perturbation increased. But the progression also has limitations. Some athletes may struggle if perturbation increases too quickly, and transfer into fully chaotic combat environments remains difficult to measure, and further research is still required. Excessive and or too much variability may overtip the scales, which may result in destabilizing coordination in early learners.
Another limitation is that Dimitri's target adaptation stage still relies on relatively stationary targets. In real combat environments, affordances emerge from moving opponents who may be attacking simultaneously. Furthermore, expert performers often anticipate actions from richer informational cues, such as subtle changes in posture, weight shift, hip position, and movement intention, which are difficult to fully replicate within simplified training environments. Finally, although representative learning design aims to improve transfer, longer-term retention and transfer across different combat scenarios remain unclear and requires further investigation. So the effectiveness of the constraint-led approach depends heavily on how the coach's constraints are calibrated across the progression. Moreover, it is evidence-informed. However, its effectiveness ultimately depends on how well it is adapted to the athlete and the combat environment. And where I'm going with this is that adaptable dexterity may matter more than mechanically perfect repetition, because ultimately it is adaptability that survives the chaos of combat.
So, to conclude this presentation, within the context of combat environments, adaptable roundhouse kicking performance does not appear to emerge purely through repetitive technical rehearsal in highly controlled environments. And Newell gives us the constraints framework, Pinder gives us representative learning design, and Yearby gives us the combat-specific alive application. And finally, the coach still matters through calibration, feedback analysis, progression design, and safety management. Fundamentally, my goal is not to make the movement look perfect in training. It is to make the skill resilient and adaptable under pressure. Because in live combat sporting conditions, adaptability is ultimately what survives the chaos.